Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 36th Urban AI conversation. We are going to start in a few seconds. In the meantime, feel free to let us know, as usual, in the chat, who you are, where you are based, what you are doing, and also actually why you are joining specifically this Urban AI conversation. This is really interesting us, and it's also a way of connecting with each other. So really feel free to use the chat to connect with each other. And for this Urban AI conversation, I have the great pleasure of being joined by Stefaan. Hi, Stefaan.
Hi, Hubert. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be number 36 in what is already a pretty impressive series. So thanks for having me.
And actually, it's the second time we're having you. So you're not only number 36,
Dear.
but I think, yeah, like number second, because you were really one of the very first Urban AI guest speaker. I remember like a few years ago. So really amazing to have you back to this webinar series. A few words, sorry, about Urban AI just before starting this conversation. So Urban AI is a global organization dedicated to the emerging field of urban artificial intelligence. We federate a community, an international community of experts to which actually Stefaan is part of, 200 international experts working, doing research at the intersection of AI and cities. We also have a think tank with which we are doing research, open research to coin and make advance this concept of urban artificial intelligence. You can have access to all of our reports, articles, events online. And we also have an Urban AI Academy through which we educate international city makers, urban planners on artificial intelligence. And we very regularly organize Urban AI conversations, actually almost every week, during which Urban AI members can present, discuss the latest idea, research, or projects. And for the 36th Urban AI conversation, we have the pleasure of welcoming Stefaan Verhulst. So Stefaan is co-founder and chief research and development officer of the governance laboratory, the GovLab at NYU. He also coined, among many other concepts and ideas, but I would encourage you also to have a look on their work on AI localism. It should definitely interest you if you're there. He also worked extensively on data stewardship. We are going to discuss it, and data commons. And I think actually you very recently organized a quite impressive international challenge on data commons in collaboration with many organizations. And the topic of this Urban AI conversation is how a data winter could halt the Urban AI summer. And just very shortly, why this topic, Stefaan published, I think it was a few weeks ago, on a tech policy, a very interesting article. We put it in the comments called like why we need a Carnegie moment in AI. And basically, that was a starting point of this conversation, like to explore deeper this idea of having a Carnegie moment. So Stefaan will explain us what is it in a few minutes. We will first have the presentation from Stefaan, 20 minutes of presentation, and then Q&A session and fireside chat. Feel free to use the chat if you have questions, remarks, anything you want to share. If you already joined, you know that I will be sharing your questions. Stefaan, the floor is now all yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Hubert. And again, delighted to be here with you. And so what I hope to do today is to really set the stage for a broader conversation, but also to add some urgency to where we are as it relates to data, because for the last few years, I've been working on making data accessible for public interest purposes, especially within the context of cities and urban planning, for instance. But what I'm witnessing as a result of AI, but also as a result of other forces, what I'm witnessing is kind of a decline of accessibility. And so that's what I would like to kick us off. And then, of course, it's not good enough to have a diagnosis, but also start thinking about what would be possible solutions. And that's where I then will reflect on the concept of a data commons. And so I prepared a few slides, probably too many, for this short kind of fireside chat. But I will go quickly because I don't need to review every slide that I have. And so the topic of today is indeed how a data winter, if we are not smart about preventing a data winter, how a data winter could halt the AI summer. And so people quite often ask me, what's the current situation of data, especially within the context of AI, because of course AI without data would not exist. And the typical reaction to that question of what is the current state of data is basically going back to a saying that Charles Dickens, in his famous book, A Tale of Two Cities, made at the very early beginning of the book, which was, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, and it was the age of foolishness. And from my perspective, this is exactly where we are in today's world. And today I will mainly focus on and start with actually, it was the worst of times. And it was the worst of times mainly because what we indeed are seeing is actually a massive decline in accessibility of data. Despite the fact that datafication is happening in real time, every time we use a digital device, every time we use or engage in a digital transaction, there is data being created. And of course, now a lot of the data is also unstructured that we can start leveraging. So each time, for instance, this series and this conversation today ultimately produces data, because content these days is also kind of data that can be leveraged for AI. And so despite the fact that we see a lot more data being generated, what we also see is actually data being controlled, data being hoarded, and we see also a massive privatization of public data that in the past could be made, could have been accessible and be used for public interest purposes. And so from my point of view, we are really entering kind of a data winter as we are entering also a AI summer, because obviously AI has its moment and has never been more important than today as well. And so we're seeing a real backsliding in opening up of the data. And I've started looking into that because I initially started seeing it in one field, but now, from my perspective, we have actually a backsliding that is the result of 8 different kind of drivers. The first one is that we see that governments worldwide are actually cutting back on their open data commitments. And that's also the case at the city level. 10 years ago, everyone was excited about open data. Many cities and many countries were creating open data portals. And what we see now is that a lot of that excitement has dissipated. And more importantly, we also see that a lot of those data portals are actually not funded anymore, or they see a decrease in actually budget. And as a result, that is kind of obviously a massive decline in data accessibility, especially data from government. Second driver that we see is actually geopolitical fragmentation. Of course, we are at a time where geopolitics creates a whole range of cross-border conflicts and cross-border tensions. And that also has an impact on actually the data discussion, where on the one hand, we see a massive competition with regard to creating data centers, which is mainly computational power, nothing much to do with actually data bases. But on the other hand, we also see the increased call for sovereignty. And so this has led to data localization, has led to splinter nets, and that also means that a lot of the data, especially cross-border data, is less available as well. The other trend that we are seeing, which is from my point of view extremely worrying, is that what in the past was open science data has now also become more proprietary. In the past, data about climate, for instance, was freely available because there was open science. And now open science is, again, scaling back. Data is becoming monetized quite often. And we also have seen, for instance, that Creative Commons licenses, which typically were licensed, certain were licenses for providing providing data openly or providing scientific insights openly, we see that the use of those licenses have actually decreased lately as well. Now, the other thing we're seeing is that and that's especially important in the context of AI, is that we see what I call generative AI anxiety, which basically points to the fact that many in the data space, many data holders, such as, for instance, Wikipedia or other knowledge commons, are becoming very nervous about the fact that a lot of the data is basically being extracted, and that extraction is only for a few that have the computational power to actually develop models. And so we see this anxiety about the fact that they provided data openly, but they never really anticipated that that data could be extracted at scale. And so we see a massive decline and a massive anxiety among, for instance, Wikipedia, but we also see others are trying to, including Reddit, are trying to have a position. Reddit even sold some of its data, which then created massive amount of backlash among its community members. We also see that AI models and the AI developers are crying foul that they are running out of data. And so we see also an increased decline in high quality data. And so that's another indication of a data winter with a different flavor, but it all adds up from my perspective as well. And then a lot of the efforts in order to address the kind of data winter results into creating of new synthetic data. But we also know that, of course, synthetic data creates in itself risks and actually might create a new winter of poor data, because each time when you do, for instance, a generative AI activity, it creates new data, which is obviously synthetic. And if that synthetic data becomes kind of part of the training data, then we already have seen the concern for kind of model collapse. And again, it's part of actually a more toxic or more poisoned kind of data ecosystem. So it's not only less data, I think the quality of the data is also being challenged as well. And then, of course, we see shifting government priorities. I mean, I already pointed to the fact that open data is declining, but also, anyway, just look at the US, but other countries also have actually started closing down some of that data, mainly for political reasons sometimes, not just budgetary reasons. But again, this all adds up with regard to having a data winter. And then lastly, data that was accessible from the private sector, such as, for instance, Twitter data or X data, but also data from Meta or Facebook, has become much harder to obtain. And some might call this the end of the API environment, where you could actually use an API to download, for instance, data from X in order to do sentiment analysis or other kinds of analytics. All this has become much harder to do, or is only available if you're actually willing to pay high sums for having access to that data. And so in sum, we are kind of in the worst of times, because we see a massive decline in accessibility of data. And I think for cities and for anyone working on urban AI, this might be highly problematic, because to a large extent, you can only sustain the AI summer if you actually, of course, have access to data, and more importantly, if you have access to high quality data that is context specific. And we see this is becoming harder and harder to obtain. Now, the other, of course, part of the coin is that we may also be in the best of times. And this is then, especially when we are looking into the role of AI itself. And we have called this kind of the fourth wave of open data, where in the past, of course, open data was quite often seen as freedom of information. Then 15 years ago, it became open government data. Then more recently, we've been working on data collaboratives, where public and private sector data was made available. But now we are actually seeing this kind of intersection with generative AI, where on the one hand, open data becomes a source for improving AI. And so this is data for AI. And so open data has a new function, not just a function that in the past was kind of supporting accountability and transparency. But now open data also has an important function as it relates to stimulating innovation. And the other, by the way, important aspect in the current environment is that when we talk about open data, we're not only talking about open structured data, now we're also talking about open unstructured data. And so we see a broadening of the concept of open data. But, and this is where kind of the best of times might come in, we actually see that AI can help us also democratize data by making data more discoverable, by using AI in order to prepare data, in order to increase the quality or assess the quality of the data. But also, AI can, of course, be used to make it much more easier to engage with data through conversational interfaces such as chatbots, for instance, where you don't need to have a data science background. You can actually just ask a question, and through the chatbot and, of course, some analytical computation, i.e. AI, you can get an answer back also in a conversational manner as well. And so it's not all bad. On the one hand, we do see that the data winter gets complemented with actually advances in the use of AI to democratize data. And we also see that open data might become kind of a critical resource for actually AI. Now, the problem is, of course, and we've done a lot of research on that, is that this can all be true, but unfortunately, much of the data that is made open, or much of the open data that we currently have, is unfortunately not AI ready. It's quite often not authoritative, it's quite often not unique, and more importantly, the quality definitely is not up to the demands that we have. And so the question then, of course, given the fact that we are entering a data winter, and that we are entering an environment where AI-ready data becomes far more important, what do we do about it? And that's where we have started working on this concept of data commons, which is basically AI-ready data that is made available in ways that aligns with community expectations. So that actually deals with the need for data that is high quality, a need for data that is very unique, a need for data that is authoritative, so that there is a clear line of provenance as well. But this is then made accessible not just by putting it on a platform, it's made accessible using a governance structure that makes sure that the data is not accessible or is accessed in extractive manners, because that's kind of one of the biggest reason why we see a decline, is because of the anxiety that if you put data open, then it's going to be used by just a few in order to actually train data in ways that is not in alignment with actually people's expectation. And so data commons is kind of the pathway forward. And so we've been trying to prototype a few, and also we've been trying to identify what is already happening. And so we have a data commons repository in order to really understand what is happening. And we see that a lot of the data commons today are being used mainly for RAG applications, so to augment existing models for then context-specific applications. But we also have seen that data commons are emerging across the world for research, for education, for content development, and so on. And so this becomes a real kind of new model, and it's going to be very important to think about how can you develop your own urban data commons, especially for making sure that you have access to the data that then can make context specific, including local specific data for local decision making. And that's kind of what we are hoping to advance. And as I said, we've done this kind of assessment of what is currently available, and we see a lot of large language data sets are currently being made available through data commons, RAG data sets, which I already mentioned, and then of course we see also the emergence of synthetic data sets that are being made available. Now, in order to stimulate the creation of data commons, we indeed just finalized a new commons challenge together with a few actors, including Microsoft, Direct Relief, UNESCO, and Harvard Law Library. And it was very interesting because we ultimately got 170 applications, which we never thought we would get that many. And especially of the 170, the majority were of high quality, which basically points that there's a real demand for a real interest and a real demand for data commons. And there's also increased activity in that space. And there were many good ones. Ultimately, we had two winners. One was CERDI, Amazonia, who creates a data commons to monitor deforestation in the Amazon. And then we had the NYU Peace Research, but the real interesting application there was in Malawi, where they have a voice data commons at the moment to really help disaster response by actually gathering from Malawi, citizens from Malawi, reports about crisis, and that then can be made available to first responders as well. So as I said, this is kind of the opportunity to really fight the emerging data winter by really making sure that more and more urban data commons get established, where on the one hand, high quality data and sometimes context-specific data or language data, for instance, gets gathered together, but then is made available in alignment in a particular governance structure that prevents extractions as well. And indeed, from our point of view, data collaboration or data commons really lowers the current asymmetries that we have in data between those that have data and have not data. Now, how do we make sure this happens? And that goes back to, and that's where I will end as well, goes back to what Hubert was saying at the beginning of a recent article I published, because from my point of view, we are actually at a moment where we require a Carnegie moment. And for those who are not from the US or from parts of the world where they have benefited of having access to Carnegie libraries, Andrew Carnegie was a had a lot of philanthropic activities during his life. And one of the main philanthropic activities was actually the creation of public libraries. Meaning most of the libraries in the US are Carnegie libraries, were created thanks to heavy investments that he made. And from my point of view, we need to make the same investments in data commons today, because data commons are kind of the knowledge commons of our age. And that could include, by the way, libraries, because libraries have become more important for, of course, data and the data they contain, including books. But we need to do this, of course, in ways that is not extractive, that remunerates content holders and creators, and also in ways that actually aligns with principles of open science and principles of the FAIR principles. And so from our point of view, we need to really start looking into creating those data libraries or data commons, and that will empower civil society groups. It will also foster algorithmic pluralism, and it will enable actually alternative AI models, especially RAG models, for then localized decision making. And I think that's the real opportunity here, and it's really needed in order to prevent the data winter. And that's why I would end by a call to action to really start rethinking data access for AI, preventing extraction, but we can do this by actually adopting a commons-based reuse model, to also call upon philanthropies, but also the public sector to support models such as data commons of responsible data stewardship and to invest in data stewardship, and then to build commons, of course, that empower communities, enable innovation, and ensure that the public's interest is served. And so I'm going to stop sharing here and see whether we can start a more broader conversation about the topic of data commons and preventing the data winter. If I can find you back. There we go.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Stefaan, for the fascinating presentation, showing actually this very dual, paradoxical role you shared. You explained on the situation we are today with both this kind of abundance of data, but also scarcity. And it's quite not only interesting but quite inspiring. Also, this idea of using and leveraging commons ID and applying it to data. I might maybe have one first question, kind of operational question. Who are today the main stakeholders creating data commons? Which kind of organizations are doing it?
Yeah, and it's as I said, it's very interesting. We have anyway from the 170 applications that we had for data commons. I think a large majority were driven by communities themselves, right? Who basically see that they have data sets, but they don't want to provide those data publicly available. And those communities could be, for instance, uh, environmental groups that actually start working together. It could also be content holders, such as, for instance, artists and authors that are starting to collect their content together in order to make it available because they benefit from it themselves by having access to that data, but also making it available in ways that is aligned with their expectations. And so it's really more of a bottom-up process at the moment. But because we are talking about kind of the creation of public goods, what we see is indeed that many of them are struggling with funding, which is why I've been calling for kind of a philanthropic effort here to really create those new knowledge centers, which are data commons for today's AI age, right? So the same thing we did with libraries now, the same importance should be given to data commons.
Do you believe philanthropies are the only way of funding those data commons, or are there other models?
Yeah, it's a very, of course there should be other models, right? Because anyway, if you're only relying on philanthropy, then you have this kind of dependency and it's not really scaling. But I'm also, anyway, so one model might be, to be quite honest, anyway, just, I don't know, Hubert, but just look at the amount of billions, and frankly, the numbers are staggering, right? Are invested in data centers, right? So why is there no policy that if you would say, if you create or you invest in data centers and there's a kind of a 500 billion, for instance, investment, and these are the numbers that are floating around, right? Just try to get your head around that. Why is there no kind of expectation that, let's say, just 1%, right, would already be a lot. 1% goes to a data commons fund, right, where you basically could then say, well, okay, so data centers without data, right, has no value. So why don't you not just invest in actually building the infrastructure, but also invest in building the ecosystem of high quality, content specific, authoritative data that can be made available, but can be made available not in an extractive way, but in a way that actually also remunerates the ones that have been developing those data commons and can also sustain then those data commons in the public interest. And this is not unique, right? So in the past, as you know, I had a center at Oxford, and we did a lot of work around telecom governance. And one principle of telecom governance is, of course, the creation of a universal service fund, because they came to the realization that not all telecom operators are incentivized to support the last mile, right? And so why can we not set up something similar for the data space where incumbents or large players are contributing to kind of a data commons fund in order to serve the last mile or to serve kind of unique data sets that will enrich, by the end of the day, the AI ecosystem, especially at the local level, and will also enable kind of applications and innovation at the local level that we otherwise would not have. And that's kind of another model. There are other models as well, right? Including public funding, of course. But anyway, we all know what the current state of public funding is.
So using infrastructure development like resources, funding to finance partially those data commons infrastructures.
Yeah.
Is it something already happening somewhere around the world, or is it, let's say, still an idea.
It's unfortunately still an idea, Hubert, and that's why I'm excited to be on your channel here to socialize the idea with others that might find it compelling and also willing to develop that further. It's just one idea. I mean, the key challenges, of course, anyway, how do you make this sustainable, right? And of course, especially within the context of the commons, right? We all know that one of the biggest challenges of the commons is actually the tragedy of the commons, right? Which is why I think we need to structure this in ways that is not extractive, in ways that actually also, because again, in ways that not everyone has access to it, right? Or not everyone has access to it under the same conditions, which is why you can start thinking about a tiered access, right? So if this is for commercial development, you could actually anyway have a fee or a license that embeds a certain kind of pricing structure. If it's for non-commercial or public interest purposes, such as, for instance, urban planning, then it could be for free, but then you could say, well, any content generated by doing so needs to go and shared back with the data commons, right? So there are ways to also develop a kind of a pricing structure around data commons. And from my point of view, because we are entering a data scarcity environment, because large language model developers are really encountering this kind of data winter, right, which will impact the AI summer, my sense is that there is probably a growing willingness to actually pay for high quality data that would sustain those kinds of data commons. Now, that also means that we have a unique window of opportunity to actually develop those data commons and to also start thinking about how would you govern that in ways that aligns with the commons, but also leverages the current window of opportunity, right? And I think that's why I think we need a lot. We developed a blueprint for the creation of data commons, because if it's just what we saw with Reddit, right, for instance, where they say, okay, 30 million, and then you have access to all our data, well, that created a massive friction among the Reddit users because it's their content, right? I mean, Reddit has no content except for the content from the users, right? So you need to, anyway, you cannot just have this kind of bilateral, right, transactions, which is why you need to have a governance structure that really thinks about, anyway, okay, 30 million, but how does this align with expectations from the users? How do we then invest that 30 million in actually ways that benefits the commons? That would have been a much better approach than just having this kind of transaction. The same thing for what's happening with newspapers now, right? I mean, can we create a commons for newspaper articles, for instance, or a commons for video, so that you have kind of a collective bargaining, right? But also a way to then ensure that content producers also benefit from that, right? And I think that's kind of what we really have to start thinking about.
What are the mechanisms we have? So you just shared one very powerful, very interesting mechanism to, in a sense, move from extravism, like a model, to kind of more symbiotic or more healthy model. And we really see that this is one of the main issues today with AI, actually. It's like it's kind of extravism industry. And we also see that it's touching, so you just shared it, the quality of data, but also artists. And we see that, for example, Anthropic is trying to find a model to potentially create, let's say, a more balanced, more healthy ecosystem. So what are the directions we could have to go towards a model that is much more healthier? Because we clearly see that the one we have now is not sustainable. Like you said it, not only for the data, for the people, for all our culture. So how can we reverse it and change this?
Yeah. And first of all, this is not an easy task, right? Because on the one hand, anyway, as you know, I've been advocating for open data, right? for a long time, because I do believe that society benefits from actually having access to data, which is why I'm a big advocate for open science. I'm a big advocate for open data, and I've been working on having the private sector providing access to the data. But what I also see is that there is an increased anxiety about just making data open, and then it becomes kind of fodder for training for a few large corporations, and only a few large corporations benefit from it. And so you have this tension, right, between, on the one hand, making it open, and on the other hand, preventing extraction, as you said, Hubert. And again, it's not all anyway extractive, right? But at least there's a concern. Let's put it that way. And I think so it's going to require very careful thinking to prevent, on the one hand, an increased data winter, right? Because as I said, what we see is actually data that was open is now becoming closed. Part of it is because of the concern of actually how it is being extracted. Like, just look at the public web, right? I mean, I didn't even go into detail there, but the public web, and of course, which, anyway, by the way, there are kind of a few large data sets that are very important, right? Wikipedia one, Common Crawl is another one. And so Common Crawl basically is just crawling the public web, right? Now that becomes much harder because of the concerns of crawling and scraping. And so now we have robotext being introduced, so it becomes much harder to actually, anyways, crawl data. You have CAPTCHA being introduced everywhere, so that it becomes much harder to actually have access to that data as well. So the question is, how do you go about this? And so we need to start thinking about new access structures, right? Where you could have a layer of openness for particular kind of purposes, such as research, because I'm very worried that the ones that are suffering, of course, from closing down data is the scientific community, for instance, right? Because anyway, you need data to do science, and if you don't have that, it's going to be harder to do. Which is also why I'm very worried with the fact that platforms are not providing access to the data anymore, right? Because it was a really rich source to understand society to a large extent. And if you don't have that, it becomes much harder. So different access structures where it remains open and free for, or at lower cost for particular kind of purposes. But then, of course, if there is then kind of other purposes, such as, for instance, training models for commercial purposes. And of course, this is kind of, as you know, this is the whole copyright debate, right? This is kind of fuzzy waters, because anyway, the ones that are training models say this is actually fair use because it's just research. But of course, we all know that eventually it becomes productized. And so there would be a different access. So that's one. So that's kind of, anyway, access things. The other one is then really trying to strengthen the collective bargaining from the data holders, right? Certain data holders, right? So that they can actually set the standards or set the conditions. And so that means that, anyway, quite often you need to have then bargaining mechanisms. And so one bargaining mechanism is, of course, a licensing mechanism. And so that's where, of course, what happens with Creative Commons, which have now CC Signal, have developed, right? There's a kind of a new licensing regime where content creators can signal, right, to what extent they want to be, to what extent they want their data to be attributed, right, and to what extent they want remuneration for their data. So that's kind of one way. Now, the problem with CC Signal is that it's a great initiative, but of course it's voluntary, so it's very hard to enforce it. And so that's where we need new enforcement mechanisms. And surprise, surprise, data commons could be a enforcement mechanism, because the data commons, right, could have an access provision that says you can only have access to the data in alignment with the preferences and expectations that have been signaled by the communities that are part of our commons, right? And so there is then, that's why the data commons is kind of an enforcement mechanism for signals from communities and data holders to a large extent, data creators to a large extent. And that's where I think you deal with this challenge of how do you signal, but then also how do you enforce it, right?
So those data commons, there are not only places, let's say virtual places to access information, but also places to protect data and to mutualize data from users. Okay, very.
Yeah, that's the thing. And of course, anyway, it's we're not talking about a commons free for all, right? We're talking about a commons that has a structure, a governance structure that takes into account the preferences and expectations, right, of the ones that contribute to the commons.
Let's say I want to create a data common just after this webinar. Very concretely, what is needed in terms of infrastructures, in terms of resources? Like, how would it work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And again, happy to share the blueprint that we have developed for setting up a data commons. And of course, this is just a start, right? Because we need a lot more practice as well. But I think, anyway, step number one, Hubert, is always don't start with setting up a data commons if you have no clear purpose in mind, right? So it's really about what's the problem you seek to solve, what is it that you seek to contribute, and that will automatically also define what data you need, right? So that's kind of number one, step number one. Step number two is then indeed is to really start thinking about the governance structure, not just the technical infrastructure of actually bringing together data, because the technical infrastructure there you have a variety of options, right? And the options getting wider every day. So it's not like there's one way of doing that, right? You can have like what Europe is developing, a data space could be kind of the infrastructure for a data commons. But what is the real interesting thing with the data commons is, of course, how will you govern this, right? And so that's then, that would say step number two is to really think about the governance structure. And then, of course, part of the governance structure are then, on the one hand, access modalities, right? So how will you provide access? Who will make decisions with regard to who has access and under what conditions? And also, of course, how do you go about licensing or anyway, providing mechanisms for access? And then the third aspect is, of course, okay, so you have a clear purpose, but what is the business case, right? And I think that's really what needs to be developed as well. Now, the good news is that if you have a clear purpose or a clear understanding of value creation, then you might also have a better understanding of actually the business case, right? Because clearly a lot of those data commons start with a societal value case, but the societal value case might also translate into a business case. Some might care about fixing that problem, or some will benefit from having that problem fixed, and that could be kind of the value proposition for then sustainability, right? And so these are kind of things to start with, Hubert. Now, of course, many will start differently, but I think having a clear purpose, having a clear understanding on how you actually will make decisions to achieve that purpose, which also means a clear understanding of the principles. And then what are some of the practices that you will instigate to enforce those decisions, but to also make it sustainable? These are kind of the elements that I think are crucial and typically are kind of sidestepped because it's so much easier to do, anyway, to just bring some data together, right? And from a technical perspective, which is not to be underestimated because there's a cost involved for sure, right? But then the question here is, of course, anyway, what are the cost structures? And the interesting thing, Hubert, that we have found out is that no one knows what the real cost is. And that is part of the problem of the data ecosystem, is that we have no real good accounting of actually data. We actually, by the way, have no good accounting of AI in general. And so we need a lot more transparency. We need a lot more guidance on how to do this in cost-efficient manners. And that also means that we need to first understand what are costs, what are recurring costs, what are startup costs, and that's kind of largely unknown at the moment.
I might have a last question on this topic just before we zoom into, let's say, the urban scale, the city scale. And it's a very open question. So, by the way, if we have computer scientists or AI scientists in the chat, please feel free really to reflect on it. I'm wondering if one of the issues we have today is not because of structurally how AI are made and the fact that machine learning, so the most of the AI we use today need thousands of data, millions of data, and that maybe if we were able to have hybrid data or hybrid AI or AI that need like small AI that needs small data, at the end the data commons in a sense would be more powerful, and also we might have less of those issues we currently have, like this paradox you described, which maybe is also because structurally AI need too much data, and so it's incentivizing like those big stakeholders to do what they do. It's very theoretical, but it's maybe a question I wanted to share with you.
No, it's a good remark, because we came to that as we also reflected on that, of course. And here it's kind of interesting. It would be really good, and some have worked on that, but would be really good is that what data and what's the size of the data that is needed for what application as it relates to AI, right? And of course, when we go to model development, a lot of data, and engineers would tell us is that actually the size is more important than the quality, right? But when we go to then, for instance, factual AI, right? So you type in what is and that goes back to then the urban, right, context. What is the current demographic population of my my county, right? For that kind of questions where you use AI, right? Because generative AI has now become similar to search engines almost, right? That's kind of the factual AI kind of use cases, not the predictive editorial kind of AI use cases that you would have. When it comes to really factual ones, then quite often it's not the size that matters, it's the quality that matters. And then, of course, you have different needs. And so I would argue, Hubert, it depends on what is it that you're optimizing for, right? Are you optimizing for kind of model, then large, and then sometimes, if you want to create new languages, then of course you want voice data, for instance, or you want kind of large sets of unique language data. But if it's about the more factual kind of applications, then you do need context specific. And that's why we start really working on localized. How can AI support localized decision making? For instance, at times of crisis, and for that you need high quality data in order to and quite often a lot of unstructured data, such as, for instance, case reports, post-crisis reports for particular kind of regions, highly demographic and geospatial reports and geospatial information, in order to really bring it all together for then being able to have this kind of localized decision making via a chatbot, for instance, to first responders. And that size is important, but is not the main criterion then, right?
So maybe now let's move indeed to, let's say, the local impact of those data commons. Can you share some local organization, ideally cities or urban stakeholders, that have already leveraged data commons to have impact at the local or maybe even national scale?
Yeah, meaning there are there are a few that we have identified as well. Some are, as I said, some are kind of unique epistemic communities, like artists that are bringing data to the table. There's one called Transfer in New York, where you have basically a set of artists working in the New York area that have brought their data together and leveraging that data for themselves, but also is now made available. It's kind of an interesting data commons. Then you, of course, have as I said, localized data commons that we have seen in India, for instance, around crisis and disaster, right? So, like, how do people experience heat waves, for instance, which of course is a real challenge in parts of the world as a result of climate change. And so that kind of data is interestingly brought together as well. So yeah, so there are a few use cases. As I said, I should look into our repository to, but I'm happy to share the repository to really provide more insights there. But then also, of course, humanitarian OpenStreetMap is kind of a data commons that was started in the past, but is now becoming more and more relevant for this kind of space as well, right?
We had actually a comment also connected to what you shared, and let's say more specifically to like marginalized communities. So not saying artists are marginalized communities, but like it was making some connections. So it's a comment from Marie Roker Jones. I hope I well pronounced her name. Who said marginalized communities are the groups who are mostly impacted by the use of data, as well as the expansion of more data centers. Stefan, do you agree, or would you like maybe to?
Yeah, and that's where we need more of those kinds of new governance regimes, right? And so one example that the data tank here has been trying to support. There's an organization in Belgium called the Future Footwear Foundation, and what they have done is basically, together with indigenous communities, they have collected data about personalized footwear, because as I might have told you about this already, but the unique aspect of those indigenous communities is that they actually have the gait that we normally should have, right? Or if we walk. All of us probably watching and participating in this stream, we probably all have kind of misformed feet because we wear shoes and our feet align with the shoes as opposed to the shoes aligned to our feet, right? Now, indigenous communities where there is still customized footwear and there is craftspeople developing sandals and so on. Well, those communities still have feet that how it should be, and they have a gait how it should be. So the Future Footwear Foundation has leveraged all that data and developed an algorithm in order to provide personal footwear. Now, the key question, and of course, who is interested in that? The large shoe manufacturers like Nike, Adidas, and so on. And so the question here is, of course, how do you make sure that those communities whose data is now being leveraged or could be leveraged for personal footwear across the globe, how do they benefit from that, right? And that's where we are working on setting up kind of a data commons. The unique element here is that we are leveraging from working with another group in Belgium, which is the Impact Licensing Initiative. We are actually, that's what I was referring to, Hubert, we need to innovation in licensing, right? And so there we are working on actually developing an impact license that they can only use that data for well-defined use cases and for making impact and shared benefits impact that also would benefit those indigenous communities, which indeed are typically part of the marginalized community ecosystem as well, right?
So we see that the readiness of data commons depends on the availability of other technological bricks, such as licenses, and that are needed actually. Like we need actually an entire ecosystem in a sense.
Yeah. So yeah, as I said, I mean, well, you need data, then you need a vehicle, right, for expressing, for having a signal, right? Some would call for signaling what are your preferences and expectations, right? And what do we mean by shared benefits, right? So that's kind of another element. So, and that requires, by the way, innovation and participation, deliberation sometimes. Then we need a way to turn that signal into something that is enforceable, and that's where licensing comes into play. That's where we have worked on social licensing, impact licensing. CC signal is a kind of a vehicle there as well. But it could also be a data sharing agreement or access agreements, terms and conditions. So there's no shortage of governance vehicles you can use. And then you need a way to actually enforce that. And that's where I would say kind of an institutional innovation of data commons comes into play, where you actually have that oversight and where you then, together with technology, can really make sure that it's only used for the preferences and expectation as aligned as well, right? And again, yeah, I could go on, but that's kind of the minimum innovation that we need in that space. And of course, some have been working on that in order to automate some of this, in order to lower the transaction cost of actually constant negotiation around what that is done. But by the end of the day, it requires kind of a strong governance structure, right?
So does it mean that the era of anonymous, like web exploration, will end because you will need to identify yourself either as an individual or a legal entity before entering a web domain? If we
It's
apply
a
this.
really, yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. And again, I'm of two minds with that because, as I said, I feel like on the one hand, this will radically impact research, for instance, who really need access to the public web to do kind of studies as it relates to trends, as it relates to sentiments, as it relates to adoption rates and that kind of stuff. On the other hand, and not all scraping and crawling is bad, right? So actually we benefit from that ourselves. On the other hand, of course, anyway, unless we can come up with a system where you have public web for certain use cases, but then for other use cases you have kind of additional access controls. I think what we already are seeing, look what Cloudflare is doing, for instance, where you have like where robot text becomes the default. We are going to see a massive decline in the public web, and we already have like the Data Provenance Institute or Initiative at MIT has documented that, and they have seen a decline of 3,000%. Of actually accessibility. And so that's what I refer to the data winter, right? Is that we see all kinds of signs on the wall. Open data is declining, the public web is declining, private sector is hoarding more and more data. We see governments are actually deleting websites for a particular reason. We see data localization happening as a result of geopolitical activities and so on. And so that's what I meant by we might be entering the worst of times. But if we find a ways to turn it, we might actually find a more equitable data ecosystem as well.
Well, thanks, Stefaan, for reminding also the importance of what we just discussed also for scientists and the scientific world, which is definitely impacted by this data winter. Thanks a lot, really, Stefaan, for joining the 36th Urban AI conversation. I'm sure we will host you, I hope at least.
People will get sick and tired of me, Hubert.
They will not. No, I'm sure they will not. A third time. So really, thanks again. That was quite fascinating to see this tension we're witnessing today and how actually data commons could be and are already a solution, and also what it involves. That's already the end of this Urban AI Conversations. Thanks for following it. Next week, we will meet again, not for an Urban AI Conversation. This time it will be for the Urban AI Academy with many instructors, students. We will present you some of the latest module. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Stefaan.
Thank you, Hubert. Take care. Bye-bye.